Now, before we get to the next session, I have a little bit of explanations to get to. What we will be having is something we call the speed quiz. This panel session will feature a timed quiz on the event app, and this quiz is different because it's only open throughout the duration of this panel session. And it will be closed once the session ends. So every other quiz that you may have been playing all this while has been opened from the start of the keynote session and will remain open until the end of the conference. However, for the speed quiz specifically, it's only available during the panel discussion. One more thing I'd like to explain about the speed quiz is that the results will be tallied a little bit differently as well. So it's called a speed quiz, which means you've got to be fast. The fastest and most accurate winners will win something. At the end of the session, we will actually be showing the leaderboard to announce the winners. So if you are very competitive, perhaps you want to consider participating in the speed quiz. We have now come to the first panel session of ISWC 2025, titled Designing Tomorrow, Rewrite the Rules, Reinvent Your Future. In this session, we will re-invite the previous three speakers for a dialogue on how economic and social systems must adapt to the challenges and opportunities of the longevity revolution, touching on the future of pension, welfare systems, and intergenerational equity, as well as the promise of longevity-driven industries, innovation, and shifting consumption patterns. Before we begin the session, we would like to direct your attention to the screen.
As Malaysians live longer than ever before, we're not just aging, we're evolving.
How do we redesign work, support, and society to cater to a longer lifespan?
Many people feel compelled to work much more because of exigencies of life.
I think it will change and evolve into a more technological-based working environment.
Some of them plan to retire earlier than the age that they're supposed to retire, and some of them say that they want to move forward. So the main differences that I see between this group is actually, like I mentioned before, the goal and purpose in their life.
Definitely not. I think the older senior citizens should be looked after like what the other countries are doing, like New Zealand and so on. They pay monthly, you know. Here they do for certain senior citizens, but most of us, we are not getting anything.
Biasanya yang tua ni yang macam susah nak masuk dengan yang muda. Tapi tengok pada keadaan, cara dia olah keadaan. Mungkin kena saling menghormatilah.
Right now, if I say who benefits from the older generation now, it's definitely us. Sebab they bring experiences from whatever amount of years that they've had. You know, let's say they've lived 80 years. They bring 80 years of experience and teach it to us yang baru umur 20, 30.
Here to moderate our panel is Noor Hisham Hussein, Economic Advisor in the Prime Minister's Office. He plays a key advisory role in supporting the Prime Minister on matters pertaining to the economy, investments, capital markets, social protection, and other related areas. Prior to his current appointment, Mr. Noor Hisham served as Chief Strategy Officer of the Employees Provident Fund and also as the head of the Economics and Capital Markets Department, and has had stints with the Malaysian Rating Corporation Berhad and Permodalan Nasional Berhad. Please welcome Noor Hisham Hussein and our panelists, His Excellency Frederick Reinfeldt, Khalid Nazri, and Professor Guy Standing.
I think it's evening. Very good morning. I think it's still morning. As always, it's a privilege to be up here. Thank you to EPF for inviting me again. I think we're missing one more panelist. Prof, I think we've had, very thought-provoking sessions this morning. His Excellency, Mr. Reinfeldt, took us through the Swedish reform experience, and I really appreciated some of his comments regarding the efforts to raise the retirement age, something that I think we're facing today. Ms. Nazeri, I think, took us through some of the opportunities that longevity brings, because we should not see aging as purely a problem. It has many ramifications, both in terms of economics as well as, I think, social aspects of our lives. And Professor Standing gave us a very damning critique of where we are today, I think, in terms of how the financial world and the economies have evolved, as well as, I think, a very passionate argument in favor of basic income, something I think I've been looking at for almost 15 years now, and I think it's finally getting to the point where it's really coming into the mainstream as a potential idea that we should look at implementing. So we unfortunately only have about 50 minutes because I think the sessions have been running a little late. I will, start off by asking each of the panelists a few questions. Before we open up to the floor, I hope to leave about 15 to 20 minutes for questions from the audience. And I think they'll give a link for you to provide your questions through the app. Okay, so without further ado, I think just maybe a general question for all the panelists, I think redesigning systems that we have today is something that's, I wouldn't say impossible, but there does require a lot of political will. It does require a rewriting of the social contract, so to speak. I think a re-examining of how things are actually organized. So I think the key question here is, how do we do this? I mean, it's one thing to propose. As an economist myself, I think we're always looking for the ideal policy, but implementation is not easy, and getting the social consensus, I think, has not been easy either. No. So perhaps, Your Excellency, if you can start off.
Well, I think the basic questions has always been, should it be done by a kind of a superpower from above telling everyone this is the way to do it? Or should it come from underneath in a kind of incentivized society where people are free to make their own choices? And I think the later version is the better one, because all these ideas of trying to govern the world from above, well, that's part of the problem we have in the world today, that we have too many leaders that see themselves as strongmen, wanting to enforce exactly the way to live. So the thriving society lives from underneath. And coming from a democracy where we have elections every 4 years and a very polarized political system with many parties, I've learned that, well, you need to prepare yourself. You need to ask the people to understand challenges that lie ahead, and I think that is in the hand of leaders to describe this. I was very clear in my election campaigns not to go on this drift of trying to make people feel fear of other people, of other countries, saying we have enemies everywhere, we need to protect ourselves, everything you hear of today. But rather looking at social reforms, looking at trying to make a dialogue on how to incentivize people. I want to make clear that I live in a society that's not perfect, Sweden or the Nordics, but I would say that we have come very far. We have very small portions in our society that stands outside, so to speak, and those who do that are immigrants that have come later years and created a kind of tension where groups that are now forming political thesis say they should be thrown out, left outside of society, and I don't believe that. I, in government, formed policies to make more legal headways into the Swedish society, where you were accepted, coming from other countries, given the right to work, given the right to live on the collective bargaining models that we have for everyone. Because the salary levels that are linked to that is actually doable to live with the cost level we have in the Swedish society. So I think there is a way to do it, but it has to be incentivized, it has to be from underneath, and to be very frank, you need to be well prepared, because if you don't do reforms that incentivize people directly, you will get these discussions only to give handouts, which are very short-sighted, and people love to get them, but then there are no incentives linked to that, and then you get troubles with your public finances.
Right.
And on top of that comes everything I talked about, of the shift of demography and life expectancy, as mentioned. I had the possibility to do that. I've also seen other governments. And it's very important that we keep our trust in democracy and in stable institutions. So many people now make jokes or point fingers at democratically elected leaders. Most of them, not all, I want to finalize, are actually trying to do their best to serve their people, especially in the most open democracies with free media. And I think this mocking of these leaders is part of the problems, because it's creating a kind of room for populism. Oh, they're only talking, they're never doing anything. But what they are doing is that they are trying to take many challenges at hand at the same time, and trying actually to listen to people. I'm not part of the right-wing forces in the world who believe in authoritarian rule, who are nation-first oriented, Donald Trump-like politicians. In my view, they are destroying the world, not building it. So I want to make clear that that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking of totally other political spectrum to support democracy.
Yeah, thank you. Ms. Nazeri, you actually had quite a few recommendations, I think, in terms of some of the challenges we have, I think, in terms of, especially on the individual level, of addressing longevity, as well as some of the things that are required, I think, in terms of the economic part of things. But that's not an easy task, right? And I think, given our own experience here, we've been trying to educate people on financial education for generations, right? And it's been a hard slog. So what can we do to improve?
That's a really big question. I think it's really difficult when talking about financial education to put the whole onus on the individual, to be honest, to have them understand, learn, and access everything that people are talking about. I think in some ways, financial service companies, governments, civil society could make it a bit more accessible and a bit easier to understand. I think that is part of it. I think the other part is being more creative with how we think about it. I think a lot of people, when they hear financial education, might turn their ear off. So recently we've started saying longevity literacy to explain that it's a completely different thing when you're thinking about a longer life. You guys have gamified this conference. I think gamifying things also helps quite a few people. So I see that it's hard, but I don't necessarily think that's a reason not to do it. I think we just have to come up with better solutions. And if I could answer the first question you asked the Prime Minister, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's all of us. I don't think it's from above or below. I think everyone needs to be involved in this conversation. I don't see how we do it without being collaborative. So I think obviously the government needs to support it. I think the private sector, the companies who power economies also need to be at the table. Individuals need to be there, represented by NGOs, civil societies, academics should be there, and we should all be figuring this out together in a very inclusive way. And one shouldn't be waiting for the other. Sometimes the private sector waits for the public sector to lead. sometimes the public sector waits for the private sector to lead. I think we should stop that and come in all together and try to move this forward, because it really does impact everyone in every country around the world.
Okay, thank you. Professor Standing, I think one of the difficulties around the basic income has always been that question of how do you pay for it? And also, I think there's a difference of opinion here, because I think Mr. Renfeld says you should have incentives related to, I think, the desire to work. But typically, a basic income program would be unconditional, right? So perhaps, and I think acceptance there is actually, how do we get people to accept the idea of having these unconditional transfers?
The most famous economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, said, anything we really need, we can afford. And it's a matter of priorities. It's also a matter of realizing we are in a transformational moment. I believe that we must shift the incidence of taxation away from income and ordinary consumption towards what I call eco-fiscal policy. I believe Sweden has one, actually. I believe, but probably not big enough. I believe in a carbon tax, for example. I believe in taxes on land value, on use of natural resources. You take Malaysia. Malaysia has a sea area which is larger than its land area. And you have incredible resources in your exclusive economic zone, which yields a lot of revenue to big corporates and so on. And it's the same in many other countries. Could easily raise the revenue and create what I've called a blue commons fund along the Norwegian pension fund model, or along the Alaska Permanent Fund model. A member of our network, he set up the Alaska Permanent Fund, and each year it gives a dividend to every resident, legal resident of Alaska. It's affordable. It's a matter of saying, is it enough priority? As I said in my talk, the disincentive to taking jobs is the current social security system in most countries. If you target only on the poor, you automatically create poverty traps. Because if you try to become non-poor, you lose the benefits, and effectively you're facing a marginal tax. We worked it out in Finland, for example. The marginal tax rate was 90%. That's a huge poverty trap and a disincentive to take low-paid jobs. And that leads to a moral hazard. You don't do it, even though you would like to do it, and an immoral hazard, which is probably greater in most economies, which is you do it, but you don't tell anybody, so you risk becoming a criminal in doing that. I think our existing conditionalities are based on the fact that with means testing, you automatically create what I call poverty traps and precarity traps. Because most people in the precariat can only get short-term jobs if they get a job at all. Well, if you have to wait to get a benefit, as you do even in Scandinavia, for weeks and weeks before you get it, and if you then say, take this short-term job, you would be an idiot to take it, because not only you would face the poverty trap, but then a few weeks or months later, you'd be out of a job again and back queuing, waiting to get benefits. And any student should be able to show that you would actually be negative income at that point. You'd be losing income. So I think we've got to realize that in the new form of work and labor, incentives come from the fact that we're human beings. We want to improve our life. We want our children's lives to be better. We're incentivized because we're human beings and we want to work. And a tiny, tiny minority don't, but the 99% who do want to improve their lives will be incentivized by opportunity, incentivized by wanting to do something. And I think that that is what we should trust people more. And I agree with Frederick, we shouldn't have a deus ex machina, too much reliance on top-down. But I believe we must trust people much more and return to the commons.
Yep. Yep. Okay, thank you so much. Coming back to Your Excellency, I think you led Sweden through the global financial crisis, I think, which was probably the proof in the pudding, I would say, in terms of the excesses of financialization in the global economy. But, you know, with longevity, there's this tension between managing short-term financial needs, the fiscal needs of the public, relative to the kind of long-term, I think, costs that are related to longevity, like healthcare and long-term care and pensions as well. So how do you manage that balancing act?
Well, first of all, the financial crisis showed, of course, that there are imbalances in the financial system and that the regulatory balances were not in place the way it should. Sweden had a different experience than many other countries because we did not send the taxpayers' money into the bank system. We were also very happy, of course, to a point, because back then there were high pressures on Iceland and Latvia, so at the end of the day we also relied on heavy things done in other countries. But the big difference was that we, in giving support to the banking system, which was needed because it linked to people's savings and to a lot of the entrepreneurs, we actually took away the shares of the owners of these banks. But we said that once the confidence is back in the markets, we will reinstall these shares into the markets. And therefore, at the end of the day, we ended being the only European Union country who actually had a surplus coming out of the financial crisis. And therefore, unlike many other countries who doubled or tripled their national debts that Guy also mentioned in his speech, Sweden is still at 30% debt level as a share of GDP. And this relates nearly only to the handling of the financial crisis. In doing so, we showed, and this comes to the balancing act, to people that we were not just supporting rich people to become richer, but we actually had a kind of stable view trying to protect taxpayers' money, which also we made alongside a lot of the reforms. I want to say that the professor mentioned the marginal effects or the poverty effects. We found them as well. We saw that people going from being out without a job into the job market had marginal effects of 90% or even higher, actually. So we worked with a earned tax credit income system that also been used by Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, but we made it in the Swedish way to make it very clear that we wanted to have support system for people without a job, but we wanted to have a clear difference for those who had a job, especially low-income earners, as kind of targeted effort. And it has actually proven to be a booming effect linked to working hours, which I think is something you really need to adhere to when you make these reforms.
Thank you. Ms. Nazari, I think a lot of the conversation around social protection and social protection reform really anchor on what the government can do, what the society can do. Is there a role for the private sector? Can the private sector contribute to this? I noticed in one of the pillars you talked about how employers actually care about what's going on with their employees and their financial standing. So where does the private sector come into this?
I think the private sector is actually critical to this whole conversation, and I think most of the time they are quite eager to be part of the solution. I know that's why we originally started looking at this topic. It came from the private sector. But then I feel like we need additional support from the public sector and others to kind of really move it forward in a different way. But I think the private sector, is always looking to innovate in a variety of ways, whether it is for their customers or for their employees. So I think they're critical. I think we underutilize them and their importance sometimes. And I think if we went to them and sought out their advice, I think we'd be pleasantly surprised. I also want to say, after listening to the Prime Minister all day, I want to move to Sweden. Sounds quite lovely and perfect, and I might be talking to my husband about that when I get home.
Okay. Professor Standing, I think just related to my question just now as well is, I think there's, from all the recent studies and programs, basic income appears to work. But maybe if you can give us an assessment of how effective it actually is, as well as how broad-based are we getting more traction, I think, in terms of adopting universal basic income?
I'm not quite sure I fully follow your question, but I'll try and answer it by way of saying that I think we're moving into a new phase. I don't like the term post-industrial, post this or whatever, but a new phase of work and a new phase in which we live.
Right.
And I don't think it helps to be too trapped in conventional old vocabulary and terminology. We still think in terms of industrial labor, industrial time, in blocks of time. But in actual fact, most people who are in the precariat, the group I write about and I mix with and I talk with, including in Sweden. I get invited to Sweden a lot, and they have a big precariat. And they want to live a different way. They don't want to be forced by the AMS or anybody else to take jobs that they don't want to do, all right? But that doesn't mean they don't want to work. They really want to work. And I think that we need to reconceptualize and go back to ancient conceptualizations, which I've tried to do in my book on the politics of time. And remember that not only should we differentiate between labor and work. Work has use value, but not necessarily in the labor market, but also differentiate between recreation and leisure. One of the things we are suffering from is a shortage of leisure and a diminishing respect for leisure. Leisure in the ancient Greek sense, where the term was schole, okay, or skole, was education to be a civilized person, not to get a job, but real education, plus public participation in the life of your community. Right? And we're having thinner and thinner democracy and thinner leisure. Because technological drives, all sorts of consumerism, you don't even have to walk around the malls here to get the extreme example. And what I think we are trying to inch towards is finding institutional safeguards, social policies, which redistribute and recycle the gains from the technological revolution that's taking place, which is only going to a tiny, tiny minority at the moment, to enable more people to pursue a life of what I call commoning. One of the beautiful things in Denmark has been mentioned this morning, is they have started sea allotments. Sea allotments. Allotment is a common area where you can farm by yourself without being paid. And the sea allotments are areas where you can grow shellfish and fish and seaweed and things. And of course, once you have sea allotments, very quickly cooperatives form, because one fish swims, in between the thing. Now, you may think this is a very esoteric example, but we need to be thinking radically in in an exciting way about different forms of community involvement. One of the beauties of the Indian pilot I mentioned briefly in my talk is there was one village community. Well, when it started, it was impoverished and very individualistic and very hierarchical. And then once everybody had their basic income, a year later, they had converted the pond, the small lake, into a cooperative fish farm. The diet had improved dramatically. They'd invested in seeds and created a sort of cooperative community. That's bottom up, if you like, but it's a way of living, and of course it involves all generations. And that is what we should be hoping, so that the elderly bring a certain wisdom. It's the old guild traditions of history that we need to reinvent it for the 21st century. So I would urge all of us to be more imaginative rather than go back to old concepts where we can find ourselves in a trap, where we can't ask the right questions. It's called a paradigm shift in social science.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem is that economics is taught as individual actors, individual firms, and we forget about the community, we forget about the ecosystem around which they actually have to exist, right? And something that we will have to relearn, I think, as we go along. I think we've got a couple of minutes before I open it up for Q&A. Maybe just one quick question for all three of you is that what we're going through right now is pretty much unprecedented. We have longevity, we have climate change, we have geopolitical tensions, which is leading towards higher defense spending, et cetera, et cetera. Where does social protection reform lie within this context? Is it something that, where's the priority here? Or is it something that we need to do regardless? If I can have your answer, Your Excellency.
Well, as I mentioned, in many other capacities, I speak about geopolitical tensions, sustainability, climate change. I could also said a lot about the war on truth, the war against academia, against science that is ongoing in many parts of the world. And maybe we should start there, because if most parts of the world actually do not know what is going on or understand what is the impact of that, then you will create the kind of atmosphere for the kind of decisions we see in modern Russia, for instance. So I think it's extremely important to keep an open society, use technology to transfer information, to respect science, to respect the findings of mankind. I'm happy to live in a society where we still have totally free media and respect for the scientific sector, the home of the Nobel Prize. But I see in many countries are going in the wrong direction. And so I think we also need to start there, because otherwise what happens is that a lot of these, we could have discussions on what is unfair or not unfair, but if the basic truth is that people have no knowledge and nothing to compare with and don't understand basically what country they are living in, well, then we miss out. It's so easy for the authoritarian leaders, the kleptocrats, the few, to actually rob their people because they don't understand that they are being robbed and what their leaders are doing. So that should be a starting point to keep up the sense of knowledge in the world.
Mr. Zeri?
I think we're capable of addressing more than one issue at a time. I don't see why we need to pick, to be honest. I think if you really dive deeper into them, they're all interrelated in a way. The geopolitical tension does relate to the environmental tension, does relate to the demographic tension. I don't think there's any way we can excise them from each other. I agree that we should be more imaginative with the professor. I think we are sometimes a bit lazy in how we think about things, and I think if we create a different kind of narrative about what's happening in the world, we'll see that they're all related and that we can tackle them all together in different ways.
Okay, Professor? Climate change? No? Okay.
I would like to make a plug for one thing by way of concluding my comments, as it were. Going back to the ancient Greeks on which I draw in my book on Politics of Time, Aristotle said the most important use of time was the word urgia. And what it meant was, literally translated, idleness. We really need to give respect for slow time as much as slow food, slow living. And it was taken forward by a Roman who made the following statement, which I think is so vital to keep in mind, especially in an aging society. He said, Cato said, "Never is a man more active than when he's doing nothing." And I think there's a lot to be said for a slow time approach. We don't have to be so frenetic. We don't have to be doing something all the time. I don't have to be taking yet more courses to get more credentials. I was checking with my grandsons last month. In 3 weeks, they had to take 22 exams of 3 hours each. And I told them that they're going to be having the next 10 years of that intensity examinitis. What's it all for? Please. We have to actually recapture what the values of education are. And I think at the moment we're being driven too much by market criteria, profit, and so on. And we need to capture that for ourselves. That, I think, is part of longevity. You learn as you go through life. I wish I'd spent more time looking after my children, spending time looking after my elderly mother, looking after things that supposedly have no value, when in actual fact they do have a lot of value. So I do think we have to approach this subject in a new way.
Yeah, no man's an island. Yeah, the value of conversations with friends, for example. Yeah. Okay, so if I can have the questions up on the screen. I think we've got a real doozer for the first one. Do we need to abolish the idea of a fixed retirement age altogether? And if so, who stands to lose the most? I'm not sure about the last part, but that idea of whether we should have a fixed retirement age at all, given that, you know, prior to the Industrial Revolution, nobody retired anyway. Any thoughts?
It depends on how you have installed your pension system. There was a talk of basic income here. I want to relate that we have a basic payment in our state subsidized pension system given to all, so that it's not linked to how much you have actually worked. And given that, that becomes, of course, a cost. Someone has to pay for that. It's tax funded. And therefore, it drives you to define a fixed retirement age. But as I gave in my intervention, I think we are moving away and concentrating less on this fixed retirement age, trying to get people to see more capacity. Where am I? How can I still be relevant? How can I be incentivized to be part of society, even in paid or unpaid work, but being active? So in that sense, it's very important to move in that direction. But the second part is about, if you don't have a fixed retirement age, it's very hard to combine it with giving a sort of payment to everyone. And therefore, I would say that we need to keep it. and we have the discussion what should be that level. That goes for most of the developed countries,
Right.
moving it slowly upwards.
Right. Okay. Ms. Nazari? Prof?
I think the concept of retirement has to be seen as having applied for only 1/50th of human history. Okay? Most of human history, people would have said, what are you talking about?
Yes.
What are you talking about? And I think that what we're seeing is a return in some respects to seeing life in a different way. In the old guilds that went back to China right at the beginning, but through the Italian Renaissance and everything, the guilds, everybody of different ages played a different role. So you used to have grandfathering as a status of respect inside a guild tradition where the person may have lost the capacity to be a mason or whatever, but was still respected and received some of the income and tribute of being in the community, and they have wisdom. So I think that the concept of retirement is fading, and I think that's healthy.
I think the professor said it quite perfectly, to be honest. Many people talk about retiring, the concept of retirement. Other people get very scared and offended by that. But I think the idea is that we've moved on from that kind of thinking, and we need to reimagine what it looks like. But I also understand it's a very political topic, talking about taking away your retirement age. So it is complicated, to say the least.
Very complicated and politically unpopular. Okay, I think I'll skip that next question because I believe the panelists will actually have a private session with the PM afterwards. So, and tax is not terribly interesting, to be honest. Maybe if I can go to the third question there. Professor Standing, you've spoken about the precariat as a new class. Do you think it's... sorry, it's disappeared now.
Okay. So
do you think we're thinking too much on a class-based framing, which could divide rather than unify efforts for reform?
Again, I'm not 100% sure I fully understand the question. Apologies to the questioner if that's the case. I do think that a class prism, looking at how social developments are developing through looking at different classes, is a useful way of seeing some of the divides taking place. If you take education, which seems to be implicit in this question, you're getting a horrible divide in formal schoolings. You're getting elite universities for the future salariat and elite and the plutocracy, and you're getting a third grade level of schools, colleges, and usually often private in many respects, paid, which is giving a false level of education. It isn't really education. It's preparing for jobs. The worst one in the world is the Phoenix University, which was the biggest online university in the world. At one stage, it had 600,000 students. And the founder, a billionaire, said, we don't give a damn about values and things like that. I mean, that's not education. And I do think there is a divide taking place, which I think is very unhealthy, because you're preparing people for the precariat and people coming out of education not appreciating the dangers of populists and liars who are standing for political office and leadership positions. And I think that means they're not being educated. And so I am really worried about that part of the system.
Okay, so perhaps we move on to the next question. How can we transition towards a society that prioritizes productive work, typically in manufacturing and services, in the current attention economy where STEM sectors might not be appealing? Anonymous.
What we did was that we, back to incentivizing again, we found out that a lot of our students were moving away from STEM items in school. So in our grading system, we have given them extra points for seeking STEM courses, because we see so much of the technological change and everything that's happening in society linked to the STEM sector. We have also given extra resources to teachers to come into that sector, because it's been tough to recruit them. So that's, I think it's a very valid question, because we have had real problems with that. And of course, that's also about incentivizing young people to see that they can be part of the workforce, that they actually can get into the labor market. Some of them feel very attached and very far distant from that. That, of course, also gives programs that we have that you very early during your years in school should be practicing, seeing how work-life functions, so that you make the right decisions for yourself.
Right. Perhaps. Any of the other panelists? No? Okay. Okay, that's a complicated question.
Which one?
Actually, I saw one just now that was quite interesting, but I think maybe the third one. How can we ensure that future-proofing strategies for an aging population actively address social justice and avoid overlooking vulnerable groups? And would you agree a system thinking approach is needed?
Are you taking it?
I'll take a stab, and then others can add. I think that's a great question. I think the kind of exciting thing about rethinking the way we've done things is that we can specifically address the overlooked and vulnerable populations from the first time. I think that is one of the biggest problems we have with our social security system, current pension systems, is it was very limited in how it looked at who to protect and serve. So I think we should use this time to be imaginative and absolutely include the people that were left out the first time, like caregivers, like gig workers, like informal workers.
Yeah, okay. So maybe I'll take a stab at that first one, actually. How Malaysia helps society, especially mom, to care for disabled children who had to leave the workforce. The government gives some money to help if it's registered. Basically, it's saying about gaps, I think, in terms of the social protection system, where certain groups are basically left out, and a lot of, I would say, civil support actually comes from civil society rather than the government itself. I mean, there's certain edge cases where, especially in this particular sense, single mothers or mothers who've had to work to leave the workforce, what kind of support should they expect to get from the government?
Well, this is a major question. Remember that I said you had to target 4 groups to see how you can get more working hours in society, and the most important one are women. We have a lot of reports looking into household balances, even in the Swedish society, even though we have better gender balances in many other countries. But we still find that women take a lot more responsibility for the unpaid homework than men. That relates to children, that relates to older parents, but to be very frank, that also relates to taking care of their husbands. So it's a kind of unbalancing that is still ongoing. So what can you do? Well, we have seen that if you actually professionalize the care system of elderly, of disabled, of giving also clear signals that parental leave should not be too long, and it should be shared between mothers and fathers. This is now growing in Sweden, that we also have a parental leave where fathers take a leave from their careers for a while. It should be 50-50 is the objective. We're not there yet, but still. So what you do is actually that you give professional help for all that is now taken for granted that women will move back and take care of. And why is this important? Because what I said, women are better educated than men. Women make better balance in society when they are in positions, taking decisions also inside a lot of the industries that we have seen. When there are women and men that take decisions together, they tend to be better balanced. So therefore, we need a society to support this. What you need to do is to make reforms to make it happen. Take new steps every mandate period, make new solutions to support, take away the burden of household, especially from women.
Okay.
Can I just add to that? I agree with what Frederick said, but I think there is a problem that we should acknowledge, which is there is a problem for young men in particular, and it's a problem of adjusting to a certain extent. It's noticeable that the most strident supporters of these right-wing populists
Young men.
are disillusioned young men. And many of them, as I say, are part of the precariat. But we shouldn't dismiss them as Hillary Clinton did, as a bunch of deplorables. That's wrong. One should say, what is causing this phenomenon? Okay? And I think it is a question of partially adjusting to a society of gender equality, which I think we all, I hope so, all support here. But it's also a point of saying, what is leading to these movements and these sentiments? Partly it's political rhetoric. Someone like Trump is creating that with his language. I mean, it's disgraceful, okay? But partly is to do with the insecurities that people are experiencing. And that goes through all the age groups. And that's why I give so much attention to, we must have a strategy of giving people ex-ante security. Security as a right. And our traditional systems don't function to do that. We have to be honest. And I think that's the motivation that should drive us to think transformatively about social policy.
Yeah, because I think as Mr. Reinfeldt mentioned just now, women are better educated. You have, I think, less opportunity for men. I think less opportunity in the labor market. Changing gender roles. I think all of that feeds into it. So we've got a couple of minutes.
Can I actually add one more thing?
Please,
Since we just launched this report this past week at the World Economic Forum, I think something else that should be remembered is the global gender gap. We just launched our latest report, and women are 125 years behind men. I don't think it's possible to have this conversation without bringing that into effect, too. That's a good number, apparently. We've helped it by 11 years, but that's still a shocking number to consider when we're talking about equity and caregiving and what women need as well.
Yeah, a lot of things there. So we've got a couple of minutes left. Maybe if we can have a closing statement from all three of you before we wrap this up. Your Excellency.
Well, just to answer to one question, as I see here, this idea that if we shorten work weeks and so on, what happens with the with my idea that we should work more? I think it's very important to say that I looked at working hours aggregated. So I'm not talking about individuals. It's okay for me with productivity to get more vacation if you want, to actually go down from 40 to 35 hours work weeks. We have seen a lot of that. What I'm talking about is incentivizing everyone to take extra jobs if they like to incentivize them to stay on when older ages. And when you do that, you do not take jobs from each other. That's a kind of incentivizing everyone to work extra. So therefore, you can't think that you either have a job or not. It's a kind of looking at the new environment where working is not so fixed as it used to be. That's my experience.
Cesare?
My closing remarks would be to kind of reiterate some of the things I've already said, which is to think bigger, use your imagination, and try to color outside the lines. Try to think about this next way of looking at living longer lives in a more interesting way, and reimagine it in a way that works for everyone going forward.
Okay, Professor?
Yeah, I would like to make two pleas. One is that even in Malaysia, and I remember working with them, so I became very familiar, we need to overhaul our labor statistics. We really need to have a revolution in the way we measure activities taking place. You cannot sensibly develop institutions and policies unless your system of statistics is giving you a picture that corresponds to reality. Our current labor force statistics do not correspond to reality. I was on the International Commission on Labor Statistics, and I see all the conventions. They go back to the 50s in a different age, so they need to be ready. It may sound very boring, but it's something that is so fundamental. And the other thing, the final point I'd like to make is that I believe we, on the edge of a second age of commoning, shared activities, doing activities that are part of the commons, reviving the commons. And historically, that's been very, very important. In my own country, all the rebellions throughout our history have been about wanting the commons back.
Right.
And to be able to do activities in the commons. And I think that that is going to be part of the new progressive politics going forward.
Okay, thank you so much. I think please join me in a round of applause for our distinguished panelists. And I hand over the session back to the
Thank you very much, Encik Hinsham, and thank you, Mr. Reinfeldt, Ms. Nazri, and Professor Standing for such an engaging and vibrant panel session. Oh,